Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Epic Tomorrows, or if you are watching this on Arkbound Media, welcome to the channel. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kate Booth and Tristan Sykes, the co-founders and coordinators of Just Collapse. Quoting from their website, Just Collapse is an activist platform dedicated to socio-ecological justice in face of inevitable and irreversible global collapse. Just Collapse advocates for a just collapse and a planned collapse to avert the worst outcomes that will follow an otherwise unplanned reactive collapse. Just Collapse recognizes that there will be no justice in an unplanned collapse. Dr. Kate Booth is an activist academic at the University of Tasmania and a senior lecturer in human geography in the School of Geography, Planning and Spatial Sciences. Tristan Sykes founded the Tasmania branches of Extinction Rebellion and Occupy, and is currently the coordinator of Free Assange Australia. But tell me if that's still not the case. I just realised I got that from a year-old.
No, that's still the case.
Okay, great, fantastic. So first of all, welcome to both of you. It's really great to have you on my little channel. And to begin with, could you give a brief history of how Just Collapse came about?
Well, Just Collapse took solid form in 2021, but I guess the longer history of it is that Tristan and I both independently have been collapse aware for decades, since quite a relatively young age, for different reasons. I had a very environmental, I guess, upbringing, focus on ecology in my upbringing, and I read Jared Diamond in my 20s, The Collapse book, and I realized that's the trajectory we're on unless something changed dramatically, and it hasn't changed dramatically. It got worse.
I suppose through high school history studying, I ran across Ehrlich and Paul Ehrlich's work on the population bomb, and I started exploring that, but it didn't really. It sort of really intuitively hit me rather than any sort of rather than a single body of work. But if I was to summarize what the most influential source, I would say Limits to Growth was the really I suppose the tone that I would direct people towards.
Yeah. And we've both done activism of various kinds throughout our lives, and it after doing some time in Extinction Rebellion, a lot of things weren't making sense, weren't adding up anymore. We had lots of conversations during the pandemic lockdowns,
Yeah,
and Just Collapse was born.
great, fantastic. Yeah, I've had a strange journey with Extinction Rebellion too. I started out really eager, and obviously there's a lot of good that came from the movement, but ultimately I think strategically they're way off now and not focusing on what needs to be focused on. It's interesting you mentioned Limits to Growth, because a couple of years back I read I think it was it the 40-year update to Limits to Growth or something like that, and I kind of agreed with I mean, I'm a complete amateur, but the way the predicament was explained resonated with me, but the kind of remedies that he was suggesting didn't. He seemed to be.
Oh, are you talking about Guy Harrington's work, or
no, Jorgen.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Quite. He seemed to have quite a. I don't know. He said that everyone should move to the cities and stuff like that, and I wasn't really sure about that, and that we shouldn't. And even saying things like we should educate our children that they're not going to see nature anymore, and they should get used to seeing it on a TV screen and stuff like this. I thought it was a bit strange. But yeah, anyway, important work, Limits to Growth, obviously. So, okay, great. Next question. I know this is explained thoroughly in your online material, and we're all aware here, but for the sake of our viewers, could you briefly explain in your own words why focusing on the climate crisis won't solve the climate crisis and won't prevent widespread socio-ecological collapse?
So the predicament we face, the root of it is overshoot, ecological overshoot, and that is basically using and abusing the earth more than the earth can sustain, replenish, absorb. And CO2 is part of that pollution of CO2 that comes from burning fossil fuels, one of the, the major greenhouse gas. But it's not the whole crisis, because overshoot includes microplastics, it includes biodiversity loss, all forms of pollution and burning up finite resources.
Yeah, so there's been a misidentification of what the problem actually is, and it's a wicked problem, what they call a predicament. And unfortunately, the nature of predicaments is that they can't be solved. They can be responded to, but they can't be solved. And that is the predicament before us as we face what some call multi-crisis, polycrisis, and all of everything crisis. We just call it collapse, but there are just so many aspects, and to focus on this one pollution issue leads to all kinds of maladaptive, inverted commas, solutions, like having a mining boom so that we can build everything out as renewable. That's and it can be, on various issues, a really canny political strategy to focus on one dimension, bite that off and run with it. And that's basically what most of the climate movement has done. They've bit off CO2 and they're running with that as the issue that needs to be addressed. But under this particular set of circumstances, that is a fatally flawed strategy for a range of reasons, including what Tristan just articulated. And it's really convenient to power, which can then set up organizations like the IPCC, and then use that organization to maintain infinite growth on a finite planet by alternate means, or by addressing this one issue of overshoot rather than addressing the full predicament as it exists. It allows them to.
Sure. There's a question. There's a question mark for me over whether the so-called mass renewables transition would, apart from all the horrible mining and destruction of biodiversity and everything, and destruction of human communities, whether it would even create more CO2 emissions anyway. Do you know anything about that? Like the amount of manufacturing involved?
Yeah, there's some work by Associate Professor Simon Michel, which goes into some degree of the quantities of, and his assessment is that we don't actually have the quantity of mineral resources in order to actually make this transition. What we would be transitioning to would be infinitely smaller, but it would be much smaller, a much smaller energy system, or we would try to, and it would also be infinitely more complex, because the nature of the energy supply is very different. It's not as versatile and easy to use as the direct power that comes from fossil fuels. So it's important to recognize the diesel and smelting processes with coking coal are used all through the stages, as well as the transportation of all of this inverted commas renewable energy.
Yeah, we basically need a hyper growth for a period to build out everything. So when people say electrifying everything, what they're making a case for is hyper growth and hyper extraction, hyper production, hyper pollution.
Right. Because otherwise, I mean, I'm not great at understanding economics. I'm learning, but any other way would necessitate a shrinking of the capitalist system. Wouldn't be able to carry on, would it? If it was a transition to a much smaller system, that although that's desirable on one level, economically that wouldn't work within capitalism, would it, to transition to a smaller?
No, it would be collapse. And I've read at least one
collapse, yeah.
example of, there was a reduction in water use in a major city in Europe, and I'm not even sure it was intentional, but perhaps it was a shrinking population or a change in demographics, and the water infrastructure was all built for a particular capacity, and because the capacity shrank, the infrastructure wouldn't function anymore. So it basically meant a rebuild of the water infrastructure so it would function for a lower capacity. So that's concrete, that's manufacturing, that's transportation.
And intuitively, some of this just makes sense in that, if you shrink down, say, a car, you take the distributor cap off and a couple of wheels, well, the car doesn't go anymore.
Right.
It's when you've got a very complex system,
yeah,
and then you start pulling bits out of it.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I'll have to think about that. Yeah. Please, could you explain what Tristan said? The fight is around how sharp, unjust, or nasty the collapse is going to be.
Do you want to, or do you want?
No, you said it. You have to explain yourself.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think the subtext of that is that collapse is inevitable, and history and anthropology demonstrate that that civilizations invariably collapse, but civilization is collapsing already, and it's accelerating. Global modern industrial civilization, just to specify what we're talking about, and so it's that inevitability that I suppose is trying to be communicated there, and saying that, so whilst as a predicament we might recognize this predicament of collapse and respond to it, we can't actually prevent the collapse. The collapse is underway, and it's not possible to actually stop it from happening, but we can have better or worse responses to it, and so that's why we try to advance or work towards socio-ecological justice in this regard, because while we have some agency, this is an opportunity to try to inject that into the zeitgeist so that people are thinking about socio-ecological justice as the process unfolds.
Right. Sure. Okay. So I'm not sure if this is a necessary question. I just get caught up in words sometimes, but so this was about the language. Is there any difference between a planned for collapse and a planned collapse, building on what you just said? Does a planned collapse as opposed to a planned for collapse mean in some ways not accelerating it deliberately, but for instance withdrawing labor from destructive infrastructures in the form of general strikes, despite the chaos that could ensue? Or when you talk about a planned collapse, are you only talking on a local focus on building alternatives and community resilience, or is it something a bit more? And is there a difference between planned and planned for, or is that just me getting caught up on words?
No, it's an interesting question, because some people argue we need to bring on collapse and speed it all up, and for a variety of reasons, but that's not where we're at. We see that the system at the moment is doing and I was about to say fantastic, but let's temper that, because it's a high-speed job of collapsing itself.
Yeah,
it's infinite growth and finite planet. There's only one way that will end. So we don't. That's not a focus of just collapse. We're not focused on bringing on collapse or speeding it up.
Accelerationist. No. Okay, that's great.
No. So we are particularly focused on what we can do, and planning.
Great.
Of a particular kind. We're talking about insurgent planning.
Yeah.
Is something that we think can contribute or help people think through how they might respond locally.
I'll ask you more about that in just a second. Do you conceive of collapse as likely to happen in a very uneven and staggered way, country by country, region by region, and demographic by demographic over the coming century or so? Or do you conceive of collapse as an accelerating global degeneration? I think you've already said that, beyond a certain point could result in severe and rapid collapse of the entire global civilization within a single decade, perhaps even this decade. And I kind of swing myself between how serious I think things are. But just before I spoke to you this morning, I watched a video by Paul Beckwith on the Antarctic ice loss this year. And I'm sure you know, the Antarctic ice loss this year is just absolutely crazily unprecedented. So part of me feels like the next year could be massive problems and devastation, but who knows what's going to happen. But what's your perspective?
Yeah. Well, we're dealing with very complex systems, and they're interacting. So the complex system of finance, the financial collapse, derivatives to the trillions of dollars that, the money printing of the US economy, the global hegemonic power and the petrodollar, all of this is, this on its own, this is collapse. But then you've got how it plays out through coca-colonialism and all the violence and imperialism and all that. And this is another form of collapse, and then you've got the climate, obviously the climate collapse and the sea loss and the albedo, the increased albedo, which then feeds back and creates all these feedback loops and the methane, and this is another collapse. But there's all of these things are all happening at once, and so I trying to sort of set any kind of timeline, when you've got all these complex systems interacting together, I just think is way too hard.
To answer your question directly, I think we think it's both. So there's this big global picture, and then you can see some places are already in collapse for a variety of reasons.
Various stages of collapse too.
Yeah. So it's a staggered, uneven. It is at the moment. It will continue to play out like that, but it's all part of this bigger picture.
And things could play out very rapidly if things, if the right amount of interactions all happen in the right way, it could accelerate very quickly. So in various ways, whether that's a financial or social or geopolitical or climate.
No, that's a great.
But the climate, the climate impact on food is
right.
And in some places, water. I mean, that is just foundational. Nothing happens without food. Yeah,
the sort of impending refugee crisis is something I'm sort of worried. One of the things I'm worried about the most, and countries' responses to that, which probably not going to be the best responses always. So, and also I guess it's good to be fluid and not put dates on things, because then if you're wrong, you don't get taken seriously. So, because there are some people out there on the web who seem very intelligent at discussing this kind of stuff, but they then will kind of put dates on things, and then the date passes and what they said didn't happen, and they look a bit silly. So, okay. Okay, this is a bit of a ramble. Some of my questions are more like me rambling, but I feel I need to get this stuff out. So if you just bear with me. In your literature and online videos, you rightly name ecological overshoot as responsible for the current and/or impending current collapse of civilization, as driven by colonialism, industrial extraction, and Western consumption. You do sometimes mention capitalism, but it seems to me that there's a deliberate avoidance of focusing too much on capitalism and capitalist power relations as largely responsible for our current predicament, which is not to say that a global communist system couldn't also drive ecological overshoot. But is your lack of focus on capitalism as opposed to consumption and colonialism in your communications an ideological or a strategic choice, or have I got it wrong? And shouldn't colonialism and capitalism be mentioned in the same breath?
Oh, yeah, I suppose and my view is that the target is growth. I suppose so. All the overshoot occurs due to growth of consumption and a population, obviously, to consume, because you need to have a population in order to have consumption. But so they're related. But it's that growth of industry, population, consumption, that relationship, and that relationship to ecological systems and how that plays out socio-culturally. That's kind of the sort of the essence of it.
So you can have, it could be socialist growth or capitalist growth or
green growth.
Green growth.
Yeah, sure.
it's all growth. So we,
sustainable growth.
Like many other people, we
Yeah.
frequently say, infinite growth on a finite planet is
Yeah.
the death knell. And I guess, and also from my perspective, if overshoot's the root of the problem, which can play out in non-capitalist systems, capitalism is, I guess, the hegemonic economic world order that has taken advantage of overshoot. So we tend to always go back to overshoot, but it's a valid observation. I think I've done some introductions in forums where I've done a list of things, and perhaps capitalism wasn't in there. So I will take note.
I just think that capitalism, more than socialism, has this great drive to create new markets, and it's the constant creating of new markets when old markets have become saturated that drives a lot of unnecessary consumption and growth, making more and more things that we don't need, diversifying in ways that we don't need 100 types of bread in the supermarket. We only need a few types of bread and all the rest of it. But yeah, thanks for your response. Okay. So considering their misleading capitalism-based or growth-based scenarios of escaping the climate crisis, do you think the IPCC, despite the soundness of their raw data, do more harm than good these days? Should they in fact be disbanded and their scientists pressured to reconfigure somehow?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks. Good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a highly problematic structure that's misrepresenting the predicament as a pollution problem that can be solved. It's
by business as usual.
Right.
Yeah. It's just a method of maintaining entrenched the entrenched systems and privilege.
Including capitalist power relations.
Yeah.
It's all embedded within the IPCC.
Yeah, it should be scrapped, and a recognition of the true nature of wicked problem of this predicament should be, and organization could begin around that issue. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that no matter how much we talk collapse, that is going to be appreciated at a global scale, because there's just too much invested in driving this boat into that iceberg.
Yeah, I guess right. Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay. What is your assessment of the current climate and eco-activism scene, as it were, in Australia, including XR in Australia, Fireproof Australia, if they still exist, Blockade Australia, and Fridays for Future Australia? Do you think any of these movements, together or in isolation, are capable of integrating the necessary just collapsitarian perspective? And would it be good to try to influence these movements in that direction, or do you think that's a waste of time?
One of our key goals, because we have a strategy, is we term it influencing the zeitgeist. So we're always working
Right.
in that idea of influencing groups and agendas and individuals. So yes to that second part. Some people, some elements of the climate movement definitely foreground socio-ecological justice, which is all good. But I think it's fair to say, and Tristan might elaborate on this, that by and large, they misunderstand the predicament.
Yeah, well, again, there's fundamental misunderstanding of the predicament that leads to all kinds of maladaptive action. And then, what you're in fact doing is you're arguing for the mining industry and the fossil fuel industry and thinking that you're actually opposing them. And while you're encouraging a hyper growth of industry and innovation that can only accelerate the problem that you're trying to solve for. It's madness.
Yeah, it's so tragic. I see all of these kids, Fridays for Future, on the streets, and they're so passionate, but they're being kind of lied to, and just, I guess, something the situation's just too complex to communicate easily and for people to understand. But it's so heart-wrenching watching this happening when they think that they're really going to achieve things which it's not happening in that way.
Well, that's right. I think I don't think it's a tangent, I hope, but this
go for it.
We exist in a zeitgeist of progress, and that there's this arc, there's this narrative progress that's so powerful, and it pervades every aspect of our cultural environment, the political, social, economic, cultural, even environmentalism comes out of this era of progress, and this period is so anomalous and so strange in the history of being human, and this is the zeitgeist that we need to disrupt as we work towards trying to get the narrative arc back to where it needs to be, which is that we are about to enter a period of decline, massive decline, not progress. And so by attaching ourselves to this zeitgeist of decline, we're able to piggyback on that and say, socio-ecological justice really matters. We've got some agency now. We can still do something for that to ease that inevitable descent. Right down.
Right. Okay. So I think you've kind of answered this in a manner of speaking, but seeing as some parts of the world, as you've said, or some populations, and indigenous populations in particular, have already experienced collapse more severely than the rest of us. And we look at places like Sri Lanka, Syria, Haiti, Afghanistan, certainly in the case of the women and girls, Myanmar, Gaza, now Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, etc. Do you see the prime audience of Just Collapse to be privileged folk in the global north who should be proactively helping the more disadvantaged groups and countries, as well as acting on a local level?
So yes to both, I guess. So we are privileged people in the north. So we speak from that position, and lots of our followers are located in that, I guess you call it a demographic, but we also have lots of followers and supporters and engagement with people from all different parts of the world.
It's quite diverse, and we've got this attitude that of being, of trying to doing our best to be as decolonized about our approach as possible. So we don't prescribe, how to, for other people, but we just sort of have some sort of general principles around, socio-ecological justice, and say, wherever you are, you're going to have to, work this out.
Yeah.
How, in accordance with your country, ecosystems, culture, socioeconomics.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Because we can't sit here in our
comfortable.
no,
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. How much do you think about how collapse should be framed so as not to fuel, as we touched on earlier, accelerationist, nationalist, or last man standing mentalities, including far-right survivalism and even proto-eco-fascist tendencies, including anti-immigration rhetoric, false colonialist racial ties with the land, recalling Nazi blood and soil doctrine? I know you mentioned this actually on your website. Already in Europe, far-right governments are increasing their anti-immigration rhetoric, and the drowning of migrants trying to reach Europe from Africa is a common occurrence. Do you agree that when talking collapse, as you put it, we should be routinely and explicitly anti-fascist and pro-internationalist? I guess the answer is yes, but...
Well, the answer is a definite yes to the first one.
Okay.
Fascism is not a just collapse. I mean, it's just not.
No.
Of any kind, including eco-fascism.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Bigotry and hatred, no. And that's one reason why we focus on insurgent planning as a collective endeavor. So it's not about excluding or putting up walls or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, let's skip to that.
The second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go for it.
What were you saying?
The internationalist.
Oh, the second aspect, the internationalist perspective. I'm terribly fond of, Workers of the World Unite and all of the wonderful catchphrases of 20th century politics, which I've been a part of as well, and passionately. But we argue that this is a 21st century politics that we're emerging into, and that the nature of collapse means that a radical relocalization is inevitable as complex systems and structures break down, which includes, in this regard, nation states and, of course, international accords and such.
Communications and supply chains, and that really breaks the capacity to organize internationally.
I guess I should have been clearer. I wasn't necessarily meaning that kind of internationalism. I guess I haven't just more like a mindset of maintaining networks for as long as possible with as big a diversity of people as possible, and all sharing stories of that relocalization and supporting each other, and which is what you're sort of doing. And yeah, maybe we can skip to the question about your response to collapse, which is insurgent planning, which is part of the strategy of just collapse insurgent planning. And could you explain to the viewers what that's all about in a nutshell, and how can that be balanced with, maintaining good relations with people around the world and so on, which I guess might only last as long as we've got the internet, which might not be forever. So
so insurgent planning is part of the social justice agenda. It's not something that stands separate from that. It's a component of I guess action within that social justice focus. So insurgent planning isn't normal planning. It's not. We're so used to planning being this top-down bureaucratic thing that tells us how to build a fence or whatever, where to put your suburbs and your water facilities. Insurgent planning, it flips that. So it's a grassroots planning of communities taking as much control like they can of their basic needs to provide basic needs. So it dovetails with resilience. It dovetails with other words like mutual prepping, very different from the individualistic
Right.
prepping.
I
So
like
this
that,
is
mutual
a
prepping.
collective.
That's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a word that's being used by Nate Hagens out of the US, and there's
I
also
know,
people
know his work.
doing prepping together in Sweden. That's the English translation, and solidarity prepping in Germany. So these things are all bubbling away. This is a left approach to crises,
And
rather than an individual approach.
and in
Right.
and in India and Sri Lanka and Africa, people are organizing around food and building cooperatives and working to provide gravity-fed water systems to permacultural endeavors, and building collective accommodation and such. So
Yeah,
this stuff's happening all around the world.
so it's nothing new. This is insurgent planning is a term, like a term that's been applied to interpret what is already happening.
Great.
It's not something that's invented.
That's a great
so we've got a little book of
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so we've got a little book of insurgent planning, which summarizes some of the research that's been done by academics, looking at how and why communities organize in response to hardship. And these communities are often marginalized, disenfranchised, and pull together to maintain as good a quality of life as possible under particular circumstances. So it's not something we've invented. It's an umbrella term, and because we have a decentralized approach, we don't kind of dictate that term onto other people, but hopefully some of the ideas can help people think through what this might mean in their local places, and they bring their own language and terminology into it.
Amazing. Yeah, I've had a brief look through the booklet. I need to read it again more thoroughly, but it does look great, and encourage everyone watching to go to the link below this video where I'll link to that. Could you explain the importance of hashtag #TalkCollapse or talking collapse and creating an informed citizenry around collapse, and what you mean by that?
Well, thanks. I think, as we were sort of suggesting before, it is this misunderstanding of the predicament that is really that creates all kinds of maladaptive responses, and it's accepting the reality of collapse leads to, it obviates necessary action for basic sort of human needs, as well as, because humans are also nature, the ecology that supports humans. So this in this regard, there is a socio-ecological relationship, and it's by understanding that predicament there can be agency. If you don't know, you can't act. So we advocate for people talking collapse, wherever they go. It doesn't have to be, hard necessarily, as sort of as hard and heavy as, are you aware that the Antarctic's on fire, or whatever it is that's happening,
right?
Whatever else is happening next. It doesn't necessarily have to be like that. We have all kinds of conversations with regular people, and sometimes it's just about saying, have you noticed how much food's going up? Have you thought about growing your own? And then just start having a conversation about what's the rents or petrol or
or weird weather events, and people will come. These aren't necessarily people in the environment movement or climate movement. They'll just say, the world is going to hell. People aren't stupid. They know things. They might articulate it in a different way to us or the climate movement, but people know. People know that things aren't going well.
So you've kind of already answered. I had this question about micro messaging and talking to different people in different ways, but clearly you do that. But have you got any specific plans to or do you do events specifically directed at different types of groups using different language, or maybe you haven't got that far?
I think we leave that to other people. That's up to That's sort of up to
Yeah.
others. I suppose what I suppose what we're trying to do is make it very clear. All of that nuance can happen in that kind of, as you say, those micro conversations. That sort of nuance exists as
Yeah.
in how you talk to your neighbors and how you talk to your co-workers or your family or whatever. But
Yeah.
but I suppose sort of our job is to be very clear,
Yeah.
like and a bit clinical, a bit like a doctor would.
Yeah.
And not beat around the bush and say,
Yeah.
this is how it is.
You're providing the core resources kind of thing. Yeah, that's great. That's really great. And as a sort of addition to that, I'm curious, have you spoken to any kind of mainstream politicians or people, like business people who have sort of received your message sympathetically, or I mean, what do you think? Do you think there are a lot of business people who, like high up business people who know exactly what's going on, or do you think they're in complete denial, or no?
Yeah, no, I would say definitely the people know, from the
Yeah.
lowest to the highest,
Yeah.
from the most well-resourced to the
Yeah.
least well-resourced.
Yeah, there is an
And
awareness. Yeah, a growing awareness.
there's an awareness. Yeah, and growing, as decline and as collapse accelerates. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. Whether it's councillors or mayors or
MPs,
ministers, the people understand what's going on.
So we don't deliberately reach out to politicians because we don't see
No.
this as fundamentally a political
Sure. Yeah.
problem with a political solution to it.
Yeah.
But we've had an MP share of Facebook posts and
Right.
and government elected people
Yeah.
engage. So there is that happening, but it's more organic than us actually seeking
Sure.
people out specifically.
One of the things about our approach is that we don't appeal to power. So we're about people. We're about people taking power.
Of course.
Yeah, we don't go to power and say, oh please,
Yeah.
oh, please, will you do what we want you to do?
I think that's what
if there are enough of us
getting wrong. Yeah.
If enough of us say please, then maybe you'll do. Maybe you'll do what we want. No,
and if we paint our banners nicely. Yeah. No, I'm totally with you. Okay. So let me try and ask this long one, but I'll shorten it. So basically, the whole idea of this, the next question was, try and summarize. I know you say that the focus should be on radical relocalization, and I think in a tweet we had a brief tweet exchange about that no kind of sort of global political revolution in terms of like confederated horizontal power structures is it's a very utopian idea. It's not likely to happen. Nevertheless, as I sort of move in those circles and I'm influenced by that way of thinking, and some more kind of social anarchist kind of thinking, would you not agree that there needs to be some kind of addressing of power structures, even as they're collapsing? I'm not saying to appeal to power. I agree with you to take back power on the local level, but if everyone is encouraged to do that in a way that's not somehow joined up or that holds people accountable for holding on to power, even in the midst of collapse. In other words, doesn't there need to be some kind of focus on radical democracy and radically democratic institutions on a local level, as much as responding to the biophysical collapse, as it were? And that was a bit sort of rambling, but I think you sort of get what I'm aiming at.
Yeah, while we have this big global agency, many of us, not everyone has it, just that uneven distribution, but while some of us have that global agency, it's exactly what we're doing. We're a global activist platform, so we're reaching out, we're networking, we're communicating, and part of socio-ecological justice currently would be, I think, upholding democracy, or trying to resurrect democratic systems that have been put under an incredible amount of strain and pressure through corruption and vested interests and nepotism. So yeah, we're not, I think, anti that. We just recognize that when people start suffering, that's going to be quite a localized experience, I guess. Perhaps. Yeah.
But you talk in your strategy on your website, you talk about the importance of using or repurposing existing groups and organizations where possible on a local level to help facilitate insurgent planning and local resilience. So I guess it's an extension of that. There's this concept, I don't know if you know, of libertarian municipalism, which is kind of associated with the radical left, from Murray Bookchin, and he was an anarchist for a lot of his life, but then he developed this more ecological approach, which also included libertarian municipalism, which was the idea that we can use existing municipal governments, local governments, like very, very, very local level governments, and kind of take them over and repurpose them to serve the local communities rather than being associated with the state. So I guess this is a kind of, from my side, it's a feeling of wanting there to be order amongst the chaos, to prevent like gang warfare and feudalism, and because I'm scared of all that happening. So I just like the idea, even though it might be utopian, of this libertarian municipalist approach of confederated structures of, you know, local democracies.
No, I think that's really valuable. I would just make this point that collapse doesn't mean that people abandon humanity. In fact, you know, and even socially constructed cultural norms. In fact, if when people get diagnosed with a terminal illness, they usually go back. They usually turn up to work next week. They don't just go, oh, do you know what? I've just decided to, you know, to eat all my babies and to go off and watch 24-hour porn or something. I don't know whatever people think that people do. They don't. They carry on. They carry on as best they can, and you know, and try to deliver best outcomes in spite of, you know, very difficult circumstances. And humans are hardwired for sociality and social cultural organization. We're even as collapse occurs, we will care for each other. That is the nature of how humans exist.
It's nice
and it doesn't mean it's all going to be pretty and light and fun, because it's not. You just have to look at places in collapse at the moment.
There are people who exploit. And there are power structures and people who exploit in the midst of collapse. So as well.
And in Australia, and this might be likely be different from other parts of the world, but we have a long cultural history of dealing with natural disaster events, particularly bushfires, wildfires and floods, and those kind of events. Local governments, the military, everyone just steps in, and there is usually this sense of collectivity, of people not being left behind. Now, it's always more complex than that. So keeping some of those structures and upholding the democratic intents of some of those structures.
And in this regard, you know, local fireys, you know, but these are volunteer firefighters. You know, this is a local community. These are locally local community organizations. Then you've got things like, I don't know, say the Salvation Army, or Kate mentioned the Country Women's Association, or all of these groups, pre-existing groups. They collectively they organize, and they get in there and they do this stuff because they see the important work that needs to be done, and they step in. You don't need to reinvent, as XR did.
Yeah.
But reinvent bureaucracy and at every scale, from the smallest to the highest.
Yeah.
You can.
I totally agree.
Pre-exist.
Yeah.
It's a completely fraught exercise in trying to reinvent bureaucracy and organizational structures. So that's one reason why we advocate for using existing stuff. Not in a way, don't join some organization that's full of bigots or propagating hate or whatever. Stay.
No, that's great. No, that's really great response. That's really great. Okay, well, I know we've just got a few minutes left, so how about this one? In one of your videos, Tristan said disrupt. I wonder quite what you meant by that.
Okay, all right, well, I'll say that there's this narrative, I think I've mentioned earlier. There's this narrative of that this trajectory, this J curve, just goes up and up and up forever. Star Trek. That is the narrative. That's the narrative that's won. That is the narrative we're going to follow until that trajectory comes back the other way in a collapse. Because the world is sold on this narrative of human exceptionalism, that we are in dominion over nature as though we're not even part of it, that minerals and resources are infinite in supply, we only have to innovate, and we're so clever, and all of this. There's this really strong narrative, and it requires disruption at every level. Disrupt the economic nonsense of endless money printing. This needs to be disrupted. The hegemonic imperialism of empire, and colonialism and export needs to be disrupted. The abuses of nation states and the abuses of all of this language, it all needs to be disrupted, and this is one of the reasons why we talk collapse, because it penetrates into this space and breaks it. And we attempt to break it apart and go, hey, look at it from this perspective. What really matters when this is our predicament, and instead of this endless arc of exploitation, we're going to go into a terrible decline, and that disrupts everything that we know, and all the cultural norms that we behave with, and so that's what I mean. Disrupt.
Sure. Can I just get one more question in? I know you've got to go. Okay. Okay. So I think I'll skip to the one about Arkbound. So I'm a voluntary trustee for a charitable social enterprise in the UK called Arkbound Foundation, which increases access to publishing for writers from marginalized groups, as well as increasingly printing material on the climate crisis, which could potentially include discussion on the deeper crisis moving forward. Would you have any advice for a charitable enterprise like Arkbound that might not be in a position to adopt an explicitly activist identity due to its legal status, but which would like to be ready and encourage all its beneficiaries to be ready for potential or worsening societal collapse? Because I have a good sort of communication going with the coordinator of Arkbound. You may have kind of already answered this, but would your approach be to completely repurpose the organization and not be a charity anymore, and kind of renounce our charitable status and do something different? Or do you think there's a kind of strategic potential for charities and the charitable sector to influence things from where they are?
Yeah, the last bit.
Okay.
So a publisher has the power to get information and ideas
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
That's incredibly powerful position. We definitely wouldn't sit here on the other side of the world and tell you to change everything that you do.
No.
That's not what we would do at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, just a publisher can talk collapse, talk
Mm.
resilience or
Yeah.
convergent planning, whatever the priority is.
And
over in the UK,
there's plenty of writers writing on the subject of that have written on the subject of collapse, and that are writing on the subject of collapse. So
Yeah.
there's plenty of opportunity to explore other people's work that might not be as well known to people. So yeah, but you know, no one should no one should take our word for doing anything. Yes, you do as you need to.
Yeah, sure. No, that's great. That's great. I'm just playing around with ideas. Yeah. Oh, it was really amazing to meet you both. Thank you so much.
It's great to meet you too, Matthew. It's just talking with people who have a curiosity about ideas and how the world works or doesn't work is
Collapse,
fantastic.
right?
Great questions.
Yeah. Great.
Great questions. Much appreciated.
No problem.